All right, welcome to chapter 20 exchange rate regimes. So, if you remember one thing from this entire video, it would be that both the fixed exchange rate regime and the flexible exchange rate regimes, they both have advantages and disadvantages. And so there is no one fixed exchange rate regime that works for everyone. Yeah. And there are two specific reasons when you would want to have a fixed exchange rate. And most economies, you will see that they use a flexible exchange rate. The reason when you would want to use fixed is when you have a tightly integrated set of, geo areas or, states or countries that have the same set of economic shocks, and they can depend on the same monetary policy, or if the central bank cannot be trusted, right, to and the fiscal folks in the country cannot be trusted to be in discipline, then you might want to tie the hands of the monetary policy to the fate and the connection with some other country and their monetary policy system. Yeah. So we'll learn a lot about those two systems and through examples. And let's start off with the famous Bretton Woods agreement that happened in New Hampshire in the United States, right? And about 44 countries came together in 1944 to, in a sense, have a fixed exchange rate with the United States dollar, right? And that the United States dollar would be fixed and pegged to gold, right? So that was the first effort, and it worked really well for several years from mid 1940s to early 1970s, where all of these countries had pretty much pegged to the U.S. dollar, right? And the U.S. dollar was pegged to gold. I think $35 per ounce or something was the peg, and it in a sense this had an international currency, yeah, per se, yeah, meaning, and the U.S. actually established itself as the international um, currency, and through which it also an international reserve currency per se, because everything was pegged to the dollar, and they also helped create this period also helped create the International Monetary Fund and then the World Bank, right? Primarily, these were created, institutes were created to avoid the economic instability that was seen between the uh, periods of war, the interwar period, and the Great Depression. And in a sense, the idea was to provide more economic stability. Yeah, it failed when the peg to the US dollar was to the gold was removed by Richard Nixon, and that was primarily under the pressure around US printing too much dollar, and dollar was left to float at that point. So this was one of the historical agreement that was quite significant, that started the US dollar ascent towards um, a global international reserve currency that was used and pegged by so many of these nations, and how this effort worked at that time and how it failed. So let's recap. What we are focused on is fixed exchange rate or and floating exchange rate. But let's really understand what real exchange rates are and when it moves with an example. So let's take an example of you are a United States resident and you are trying to get a McDonald's burger, right? And some fries maybe, and you want to compare how much you're spending in the United States, yeah, and how much, let's say, the same dollar in exchange in real terms could give you real items, and assuming the quality is the same and in the same set of quantity of goods you get for the price you pay. So that's like a very clear barometer for us to check the prices, yeah. So let's use that example. So exchange rate, real exchange rate E, small e, is equal to capital E, nominal exchange rate for a domestic currency into the foreign currency, times price in the domestic currency, yeah, divided by price in the foreign currency. So that gives us the exchange rate, the real exchange rate, using the nominal exchange rate of the currency, price in domestic terms, and price in foreign terms. So so that gives us a very clear understanding of when real exchange rate changes. It changes when nominal exchange rate changes when price um, changes in domestic, when changes when price foreign changes. That's when real exchange rate, ability to exchange real stuff, changes. So to make it even more concrete, as of February 2025, we see that the nominal exchange rate between the US dollar and the Indian rupee is around 87, meaning if you go and convert your $1, you will get 87 rupee. Yeah. And so by that, what happens is we can get E is equal to 87. The nominal exchange rate for a dollar into rupee is 87. So we are able to get for every dollar 87 rupees. So E is equal to 87, right? And price level. Let's say I'm trying to buy a similar item in India and US. Let's say I'm buying this hamburger, or a plant-based McVeggie or some burger, and let's say that burger is costing me $5 in United States. So my P price domestically is $5. P star, which is I will then check for the exact same good that I just bought in the US, what is the price in India? And so price in foreign currency for that same item, let's say, is 250 rupees. So then P star would be 250, P would be 5, E would be 87. And if I substitute all of that, I will get E is equal to 1.74, real exchange rate of 1.74. What that means is that I can buy one burger in India, in US, um, but the same amount I could, if I, in $5 I could get a burger, but I could get 1.74 burgers, real burgers, for the same value for $5. Yeah, because my $5 would give me this much rupees, and I only need 250. So in a sense, you could see how many burgers you could buy in India through this exchange rate, real exchange rate, 1.74 versus 1 in US. Or you could say that one Mac burger is in US is 1.74 times more expensive than an Indian Mac burger, right? McDonald's burger. So that's the way to really quickly understand. So then if we understand this simple example, then we can understand when the real exchange rate changes. Well, the real exchange rate changes with three ways. One, if there is a decrease in the dollar price of the US burger, yeah, there's a decrease in P, great. Then we will have real exchange rate go down, right? If there's an increase in the rupee price of the Indian Mac burger, yeah, if there's an increase in P star, you will see that then that E will become smaller, or you know relatively your exchange rate becomes smaller there. Or you could say the decrease in nominal exchange rate, yeah, meaning E, the currency. This is where we would want to look at, like, what is the exchange rate happening, right? And so through the decrease in nominal exchange rate, E, decrease in value of dollars in terms of rupees. So if this decreases, real exchange rate decreases. So that's the three factors: changes in nominal exchange rate, changes in domestic price level, changes in foreign price level. If you understand this intuitively, then everything else after this will be easier for us to follow. And you should also look at the MAC index that the Economist magazine, I believe, publishes, that gives you an even more intuitive way to compare different purchasing power parity across different countries, and that's a related concept as well. All right, so IS relation in an open economy, to quickly recap, y is equal to c plus I plus g plus nx, right? And c is a function of output minus taxes. I, investment, is a function of output, negatively depending on real interest rate. And nx is a function of net exports, function of local income, global income, negative, global uh, local income, global income, and real exchange rate. So now we're connecting the real exchange rate here that we just learned previously. And so if you were to replace E, real exchange rate, by the nominal exchange rate times the prices, the price of domestic good and price of foreign good, and if we replace R by I minus pi, remember I is equal to R plus pi, so we can replace I by I star minus pi, and in a sense we can rewrite this entire formula in a short form which says, hey, output is output Y depends negatively on the real exchange rate. Yeah, it depends negatively on this real exchange rate, yeah, which we just looked at here. It depends positively on government. It depends positively on government spending, negatively on taxes, negatively on um, domestic real interest rate, yeah, which is this entire or R, right? Or yeah, so domestically, if you have, we've gone through all of this in the previous set of videos, so this is not clear, you should go recap. I'm just adding a few more things here, which is we're adding the real exchange rates part of this, and then Y star, yeah, positively on foreign income output grows. So if you understand this, then what we also realize is that in the short run, fixed nominal exchange rate implies fixed real exchange rate, right? Um, and assuming the price level stays the same relatively, um, then what we see is that in the medium run, a real exchange rate can adjust even if the nominal exchange rate is fixed. So if we look at from the perspective of fixed exchange rate, real exchange rate can adjust primarily through the movements in price level, right? And so we know how that works. And um, if the price level changes, yeah, you could still have I as same, but the real exchange rate will change through the differences in price level because things can get more pricey. So that's the key connection here to quickly remember. This is our famous Phillips curve that we've seen in chapter 8, and so this is the same setup here. Yeah. So now we understand also the connection here of what output depends on, positive, negative, and all of the factors. That'll help us to really understand some of these charts that we will see. Yeah. And this situation about European monetary system, the EMS, which was set up in um, which was set up in 1979, um, and it worked really well until 92, and where there are a lot of issues come up, right, where we start to see here exchange rate of selected European countries relative to Germany, right? So Deutsche Mark from 92 to 93. So what had happened, folks, is the EMS system was created to stabilize the exchange rate for a future, union of the European Union. And so here they're trying to get to a fixed exchange rate with a common currency. Yeah. And so the countries participating in this EMS uh, had to keep their currencies within the narrow bound for most currencies, like 2%, and of the German Deutsche Mark, and 6% for weaker currencies. So that was the requirement. And this is where that requirement of this fixed band started the issues that we started to see in this exchange rate crisis in 1992. What happened was there were certain economies, all of these, that actually deteriorated or based on their actions, or also certain ones, like we will see in the upcoming slides, Spain and others had uh, higher inflation and weaker growth compared to Germany, and that was not realistic to continue. And when that happens, you require to have um, much higher interest rates that you would have to give for your bondholders to hold your bonds. And so there was a lot of financial speculation around this time that this just cannot continue. And there's a famous George Soros example where he actually shorted uh, um, the UK pound currency, right? And the United Kingdom central bank couldn't defend it, and so even after, because of the speculative attack being so large across different financial institutes that were actually shorting the currency, that they had to give in, right? And they couldn't maintain the same level, and the parity that they were expected to maintain using their foreign reserves, they couldn't maintain it, and so they had to devalue, yeah. And that's where a lot of these people, George Soros specifically, made money in 1992, speculating against the UK pound, right? And so we see how currency rate crisis, when you have this fixed rate regime, there could be this kind of situation that can emerge, right? And this is what we saw in 1992. So especially when you have this fixed exchange rate, there are these pros and cons you have to think through, right? There is a pro here. If it works really well, you have, you know, um, once it's integrated, you have low transaction costs, because if you move from country to country, you don't have to keep changing your currency. You can compare, goods become more competitive as people buy across different countries, and then try to look for prices across where they get the best price. So lots of pros, but there's lots of these cons as well, especially if you don't suffer the same set of shocks. And that's when a lot of these issues start to happen. Um, so then there was a pro and con for that. And specifically, if you look at Spain in the period after, so you look at this period is 92 to 93 period, so about 2 years period. But if you look at from 95 onwards, right, we start to see that there is a boom and then there is a bust, right? So there's a huge boom that happened from 95 to 2007, where we started to see that the current account surplus, so the Spain was in current account surplus about 2%, went all the way down to deficit of minus 8%. Yeah. And at the same time, the real exchange rate actually became stronger, appreciated. And at the same time, we see unemployment go down significantly during the boom period, and also went way above the pre 95 levels of 20% to close to 25%, right? And this all comes down to this real exchange rate formula that we went through. And so what happened here was, due to this huge boom from 94 to 2007, we saw the unemployment numbers go down, right? Because they needed to produce more goods, yeah. And so when those people were employed, more and more of these people were employed, they were given higher wages. They had to be given higher wages. If you had to keep a lot more people employed, guess what will happen? They will expect higher wages, or if not, they'll shift to some other company that will give them higher wages. And so, for both of these reasons, what happened is there's a deterioration in the current account balance, right? Because more imports started happening. Why? They had higher wages. They could afford to import more, right? So more import, so current account balance, due to which net exports, right? So exports minus imports, the current account balance started to deteriorate because imports went up, right? So that is a way in which you can look at this boom period, and similarly look at this bust period, right? From starting 2008 onwards. Um, So that is an easy way to understand how current account balance got deteriorated due to the various boom and bust cycle, and how the currency, the real exchange rate, also appreciated in a big way, making some of the goods not competitive, right? And so that's an important part to remember. When your exchange rate becomes higher, your goods in real terms are going to become more expensive. We just looked at the United States Mac burger versus India, right? If it's expensive to buy the burger in the United States, if someone could wait, they're going to take a flight, and no one does that. Like, you can't buy a Mac burger in the US and substitute it for a Mac burger in India. You have to travel all the way 24 hours and then come back. And that's expensive, like $4,000, right? So it's just an example, right? So in a sense, what we see is that um, there is this boom and bust period that has an impact on exchange rate that happens. And the key thing you might wonder is that there was this Spain adopted the euro in 99, right? So in 99 is when they adopted the euro, and they had a fixed nominal exchange rate with the rest of the eurozone. So you might be wondering, like, oh, how are they able to, shouldn't they have the same exchange rate? Yes, nominally, but real exchange rate can be different, right? After they adopted the euro, one currency, but real rate is different primarily through differences in inflation and differences in productivity and growth in these two countries, right? So price levels could be different. So real exchange rate can be adjusted with price level in that situation. So now let's turn on to flexible. So far we looked at fixed. We looked at an example of Bretton Woods is where it started with the fixed, right? And then we looked at the euro area, trying to get a common currency fixed rate and everything, right? With now let's look at flexible. What is the exchange rate movements that comes with flexible, and what drives it, and what are the pros and cons of flexible? Um, so again, if you look at the interest parity equation that we've seen so far, we can derive E expected uh, uh, exchange rate is going to be dependent on the domestic interest rate, nominal interest rate, foreign interest rate, and also the expected exchange value in the future. So similarly, this can continue to be replaced with ET plus 2, T plus 3, and all the way so on and so forth. So what we see here is that there is a huge dependency. The level of today's exchange rate, yeah, ET, will move one to one with future expected exchange rate. Yeah? Whatever the future expected exchange rate is, and depending on how far into the future you want to look, it's going to look at all of those values. That level today depends on all of those future values. That's super important to remember, not just next year. All of the future expected exchange rate that you have. And the exchange rate also moves the future expect based on future and expected interest rate moves in either country. Yeah, take a look. This is domestic country. Any change in nominal interest rate domestically, or any change in nominal interest rate in foreign country also moves your current exchange rate today. Yeah? So that's where we start to see that there is a lot of volatility. There's a huge amount of volatility because any of these things can change the exchange rate. Um, and so expectations, we've seen has a huge impact as well, right? And so the con here with flexible exchange rate, the reason why we discussed this in the slide is there's a lot of things that it depends on, right? Fix is it's like just depend on whether the fix the country is doing one thing. Here it's going to be dependent on local interest rates this year, next year, and all the way to the future. Interest rates globally with the foreign country that we're actually exchanging from, and all they are exchange nominal interest rates into the future and expected exchange rate into the future. So there's a substantial exchange rate fluctuation that you need to be okay with over time for you to be able to use flexible exchange. It gives you the pro is that you have control over your monetary policy and have control over your exchange rate, and you can quickly change the currency exchange rate and not have to wait for slow price level changes as we saw in the previous fixed exchange rate, which can take pretty long time, and it can be quite hard for people to go through that because it could cause huge recessions if it's not quickly changed, right? So, United States is a perfect example of where a fixed exchange rate is across all the states in the United States. Right, California has the same dollar that's in use in New York, and so, but Eurozone has different countries and um, they don't experience the same shocks. That's one thing. And at the same time, United States has one central bank, right? And each of these countries had their own central banks before it moved into the eurozone, euro area, and European Union, right? And so, um, what is the criteria to use between a fixed versus a floating exchange rate, right? And the United States is a perfect example of a fixed exchange rate for all of the states in the United States. And there was floating exchange rate, right? Before the EU came together with some of these countries. And the three criteria that are needed for choosing a fixed exchange rate um, is that you either have countries experiencing similar shocks, because then you can have a monetary policy that works across the board in the same way. That's great. If you have one of these three things, it's good. Yeah. Um, or if you have countries experiencing different shocks, but the price and wages must be very flexible, meaning you should be able to hire and fire people quickly. You should have ability to change prices quickly, because then you can adapt to changes and shocks that you have. Or if you can't do that, then at least if you still have different shocks, then you must have high factor mobility, meaning you should be able to move your people to other countries. Like Poland should be able to go to, let's say, Germany, and Germany should be able to go to France, and people from there should just move. But that becomes hard because the language is different, the culture is different across these different countries. And so that's where this becomes even harder, right? For them to be as easy as the United States, right? Have the European Union be as transparent as the United States, right? So you need to have one central bank that actually makes changes in it. You have capital mobility, you have people factor mobility, you have all of those things that can absorb shocks, right? From one state to the other state, or one country to the other country. So those are three reasons that Robert Mundell, remember the Mundell-Fleming model that we went through? That's the same person who came up with this optimal currency area. That if you satisfy one of these three, then it's actually a good way to have the same exchange rate across in that currency area. And to end, let's look at the story of how Argentina's currency board, which is one way to do hard peg, right? Meaning you could say, I'm not going to have my local currency, I just use the dollar. That's a dollarization hard peg. Currency board is another way in which you're ready at the central bank to exchange um, uh, local currency with dollar, and that's also a way to do a hard peg, and that's what Argentina did. But they also, some benefits of doing that. There's also cost benefits is seigniorage, right? You could actually get the profits of issuing local currency, but at the same time, remember it has to be backed by the dollar. The central bank has to be able to issue that dollar. So what they did is, what was the background of them setting this up, right? In 1991, due to super high inflation that they saw, there was a huge amount of instability, and the fiscal authorities lost credibility because they were just printing money. to finance their deficit. And so the Argentina's president announced during that time adoption of a currency board that would stand ready to exchange its pesos for dollars on demand, however many that are needed. So 1 peso equals US dollar. And so then what they did is they actually pegged themselves to the US dollar using a currency board, right? And that worked really well for them as inflation fell from um, pretty high number to like close to 3-4% in 94. So within 4 years, inflation was under control, right? But it collapsed primarily because of various shocks that um, led to capital flight and drop in exports in Argentina. So Asian financial crisis, Russian debt default, and several other external shocks. Um, and at the same time, the dollar was appreciating, right? Safe haven. And that made Argentina's good. Um, they were fixed to the exchange rate of the dollar. Argentina's good were not competitive because the real exchange rate appreciated, and so they were more expensive, and so no one was willing to buy their exports, and so the exports dropped, output dropped, a huge amount of recession that was prolonged from 98 to 2001. Poverty was rampant, social unrest, high unemployment, and that led to, in 2002, give up the currency board and let the pesos float. They defaulted on their debt, and that led to another major financial crisis, right? So this is an example. Argentina's example is what is quoted as one of the dangers of rigid and fixed exchange rate systems, right? Especially when the underlying economy is not in a strong position to sustain it, right? Because all of this started because of the economy not being strong enough, right, to adjust to shocks, to have the flexibility of movement. And so some folks, some economists would say dollarization would have solved some parts. Yes, it could have solved some aspects of currency not being devalued, um, but there are still structural issues which would not have been solved with Argentina. So this gives us some example of how Argentina went through this fixed currency pegging with the currency board. And there's another thing you can look into on your own, which is called dollarization, where you completely get rid of local currency, meaning no pesos in case of, let's say, Argentina, just dollar, right? And that's like very high credibility, but you lose a lot that you get some flexibility from the currency board. So that brings us to the end. Both flexible and fixed exchange rates have advantages and disadvantages. Most economies, if you look at, will prefer a flexible exchange rate, except when you have the satisfaction of the three conditions that we went through, right? You have a zone, a set of countries which have which meet one of those three criteria. So yeah, like the eurozone, then that, but still it's very challenging. They're still facing a lot of issues. That's one potential. Or like the United States is a good one, which is one central bank, dependable central bank, so one currency across all the states in the United States, right? So that works out really well. But you'd want to dollarize if you're another country, if you cannot really have your fiscal policies be dependable, credible, and that the monetary policy need to be tied, you would want to dollarize and have a fixed exchange rate. Yeah, but you lose a lot. You lose ability to change the nominal interest rate. You lose your ability to be dealing with shocks if they come, because now you're pegged to some other country. All right, so that's chapter 2, exchange rate regimes. I'll see you all in the next one. Thanks.